Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody, and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. That was Tex McIver himself, the defendant, in his sentencing hearing, speaking to the judge. Now, remember, for anybody just joining us, Tex McIver was a prominent attorney who was found guilty of felony murder in connection with the shooting death of his wife, Diane McIver. He shot her from the backseat of a moving car. The jury believed that that wasn't an accident, as his defense team claimed, but they said it was felony murder. It wasn't really intentional murder. What they said was, during the commission of a felony, which was aggravated assault, that's assault with a weapon, a gun, someone died. Diane died. And that is another loophole, another way to get that murder charge in there, and the jury found him guilty of felony murder. The judge ultimately sentenced him yesterday to life in prison with the possibility of parole, but before he delivered his scathing sentence to Mr. McIver had the opportunity to speak directly to the judge. And you were listening just there. He was talking about how he received an outpouring of support from people that watched the trial, family members, people out there who really supported him. And you'll hear later on about what the judge thought of his words during the sentencing hearing. But I want to talk more about the McIver case, because there is a lot of moving parts in this, and also, what are his chances of actually getting out of prison? Let's talk about that right now with forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, good to have you.
Good to be back with you, Jesse.
So we know that he has the possibility of parole. He's 74 years old. That possibility of parole won't happen until 30 years. He's basically looking at the rest of his life in prison unless his defense team can mount a successful appeal and get him out of prison through some sort of new trial or some sort of reversible error. Now, the question becomes, and that's a complicated issue, but that's what we want to talk about right now. What are his chances with an appeal? And by the way, for anybody who doesn't know, that an appeal could take at least a year and a half for the Georgia Supreme Court to even hear it. Now, there were some interesting things that happened in this case that I believe probably are a good source of contention on appeal. For example, you're an evidence guy, Joe. The crime scene was the vehicle where Diane died. Did you know, and maybe our viewers didn't know, that evidence, that SUV wasn't submitted into evidence by the prosecution, but the judge did it himself? In other words, if the judge didn't submit that SUV into evidence, the jury wouldn't have had an opportunity to go in and look at it for themselves. What do you think about that? Yeah,
that's been raised several times, and yeah, I remember it quite well. It caused us all to kind of raise an eyebrow vis-a-vis the judge's submission, and also, you know, this case is unique in the sense that with the vehicle is essentially a crime scene on four wheels, and there was some question as well as to what the security level of this vehicle had been in the interim by the time all of these people got to take a look at it, where it had been kept, who had access to it. And all these things go back to this idea that I am sure is going to come up in appeal, and that is the continuity of evidence. These things that we teach at even the collegiate level at JSU, as well as in the police academy, and that is the chain of evidence. And this is the biggest piece of evidence that we have.
The jury was actually able to go into that SUV while handling the firearm. That in and of itself is problematic, and that's also problematic, as we said, because the judge was the one who submitted it into evidence, not even the prosecution. Now, Joseph, I want you to stand by because we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we are going to play more of Tex McIver's statement to the judge and also analyze not just that, not just the judge's sentence of Mr. McIver, but as Joseph and I talked about, other points in an appeal that may be successful for Tex McIver moving forward. Maybe he could get a successful appeal, and maybe he would step out of prison one day. But that's easier said than done. We'll be back in a minute. A lot more to discuss. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm Jesse Weber. We are covering a lot here on the network right now. Our program is packed with some very interesting things. We played you our top crime stories earlier. We were talking about Tex McIver, which we're about to talk about. But let's talk about our main trial of the program. We're waiting for a live feed, and it's out of Massachusetts. It's the Reverend Shaun Harrison case, a Boston pastor who's in a lot of hot water. We have a short report about that case. Take a look. Thank you, Anthony. Great report there on the Shaun Harrison case. So let's talk a little bit more about it with Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. Joseph, in your opinion, what are the key pieces of evidence tying Mr. Harrison to the drug trade? You know, I think that's a really important point. Was it what was found at his apartment? Was it what we learned yesterday from 3 individuals that were arrested leaving his apartment or allegedly leaving his apartment? What do you think, in your opinion, so for our viewers and our listeners can try to tackle into, what is the evidence that he really is a drug kingpin?
Yeah, I think that we have to start at the basics. Those elements of evidence that are found in his dwelling, I think that kind of lends itself to the foundational underpinning of the case, and that's one of the things that we start with in forensics and investigations. What do we have before us? What can we see? Those things, and then kind of piecemeal together and woven together in a bigger tapestry are all of these associates that were involved. These, let's go ahead and say it, high school students, which is kind of a head scratcher in and of itself. And their testimonial evidence that has come forth, and it again, as I stated yesterday, this paints a very, very bleak, dark picture of this life that he's alleged to have led, and then kind of the capper with all of this is the idea that he is alleged to have shot this young man. This brings us back to things like ballistic evidence and tiebacks to this history of apparent violence that he has, that he'll go to certain lengths, almost no lengths at all, to enforce this gunshot that he is alleged to have perpetrated on this young man. This is not a warning, Jesse. This is not a warning. This is something that has a high level of lethality to it. It's violent. It's dirty business. And so you combine all of that together, and that paints, again, a very insidious image for us.
We talked about it yesterday, I think, that the idea of if whoever shot Mr. Rodriguez thought he was dead, because otherwise you would have gone for a second shot. But Mr. Rodriguez survived. He survived, and he testified in open court against Harrison. And as we said, there's a lot of different evidence pointing towards Harrison. What was found in his apartment was guns, ammunition, drugs. You saw 3 people allegedly leaving his apartment that had guns on them, drugs on them. They had cell phones where it was clear that they were having a text message conversation with Harrison. And then you had multiple witnesses who coming forward saying, Harrison, I saw him smoke weed. He smelled like weed. His office smelled like weed. He had weed. I saw him selling weed. He offered me weed. He offered me to sell weed. And it's all becomes a really complicated mess for a person that was in the community, by all accounts, to see him as a great guy. He was the Rev. He was the Reverend Harrison. He was living his life. He was an anti-gun, anti-violent activist. So, as I keep saying, it seems like something out of Breaking Bad, and we will talk more about it when we have that live feed. So, Joseph, stand by. We're going to switch gears right now because I want to go back to something that we talked about before the break. This was the Tex McIver case, because that's another case we've been covering here on Law and Crime. Tex McIver, a prominent attorney who was found guilty of shooting and killing his wife. He was found guilty of felony murder, and that carries with it, which he was sentenced to, life in prison with the possibility of parole. But before he was sentenced yesterday, Mr. McIver himself was able to speak to the judge and give his points about what his views are in terms of sentencing. Earlier in the program, he was talking about the level of support he was receiving from people who watched his trial. What else did he tell the judge before the judge ultimately rendered his sentence? Take a look.
The luckiest day.
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody, and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. That was Tex McIver, the man himself, the man who was convicted of felony murder in connection with the shooting death of his wife, Diane McIver. He was He was convicted by a jury, and then what you just heard was his sentencing hearing. The judge would have to was listening to what Mr. McIver said, and then right before we cut out, he's about to give his sentence about what he thinks would be an appropriate punishment for Mr. McIver. Before we tell you what before we actually show you the judge's sentence of Mr. McIver, I want to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. Now, you heard that. You heard Tex McIver had the opportunity to speak to the judge, opportunity to speak to the world, because we're broadcasting it, and a lot of different outlets are broadcasting it, even though everybody should be watching and listening to Law and Crime, so I don't know why they'd be going anywhere else. But the point is, that was his opportunity. We sat through that case months. What did you think of what he said?
I think that he's trying to paint a very compelling picture of the relationship that he had with Mrs. McIver, and I don't doubt that there was love there. Of course, I'm no poet, so I don't really know, but I think circling back a bit, and one of the big questions that's going to be asked here, and is being asked all around everywhere I go, and people talk to me about this case that have watched us talk about it, is the I word, and that is intent. What were his intentions that fateful night? Did he set out with, I don't know, in some framework they would say malice aforethought to perpetrate this crime? And again, I think we're left wanting in this case, and this is going to come up on appeal when the appellate bench hears this case. These appellate functions many times, they're done quietly. You don't have the click of cameras, you don't have the pressure that's there. These judges will sit back and closely examine this evidence, every jot and tittle, and at the end of the day, it will come down to intent. They kind of went a long way around the barn, didn't they, Jesse? Bringing up this ag assault.
I couldn't agree with you more. So the jury, remember everybody, the jury didn't come back with the malice murder. They found him not guilty of that. That's basically intentional murder. What they said was he was guilty of felony murder, which means during the commission of a felony, which is aggravated assault with a weapon, obviously that makes sense, she died. That's a loophole there to get him hooked on the felony murder charge. So what did the judge render? What was his ultimate sentence? We're going to play that for you right now, and then Joseph and I have a lot to discuss about the future of Mr. McIver. This is Judge McBurney's sentence in the Tex McIver case. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and you just heard Judge McBurney sentence Claude Tex McIver to life in prison with the possibility of parole for felony murder in connection with the shooting death of his wife, Diane McIver. Now, that was a scathing review of Mr. McIver and Mr. McIver's words to the judge. Let's bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. I thought it was very interesting, Joseph, when he said you had all this time to talked about all these things, the outpouring of support, everything. But you never mentioned that you were sorry because you really are the cause for Diane's death. Now remember, for anybody just joining us, he shot her from the back seat of a moving car. He claimed it was an accident, that he fell asleep with the gun. But even if the jury came back and thought it was an accident, even if they thought it was intentional, even as they did ultimately come forward and say he maybe didn't intend to kill her, but he intended to pull that trigger, at the end of the day, everybody didn't debate the fact that he was the cause of her death. So even if he doesn't believe that he intentionally killed her, the judge made a great point, that he wasn't sorry for what he did.
Yeah, I mean, but at the end of the day, would it have made any difference with the sentencing, I think? And, the judge had his mind made up, I'm sure, before he entered in there. And to say that this is probably a dig at McIver from the bench, I would say is kind of accurate. I don't know, does sorry equate with an admission of guilt here? And we're kind of beyond that at this point. I don't know how impactful that was in the whole grand scheme of things, but what I do know is that at the end of the day, the judge is going to come under some bright light.
And that's what I want to talk about, Joseph. I'm glad you mentioned it. We want to talk about the judge, how he operated this courtroom, and what happened during the trial, because Mr. McIver's only chance of stepping out of prison again is a successful appeal. Now, the way we can talk about this is because even with the possibility of parole, he won't get a chance of parole until 30 years. He's 74 years old. You do the math. Everybody do the math on that. But the point is, let's talk about an appeal. We talked about it a little bit earlier. What were certain points during the case that might be good grounds for an appeal? One of the things that I want to mention right now is the jury themselves were able to ask 298 questions of different witnesses during the course of this case. And it's being argued that they took the trial into their own hands and decided it based upon the evidence that wasn't presented to them or the theories that wasn't presented to them, but they created their own case, their own trial based upon their own questions. I'm curious as to your thoughts on that point, as well as was there anything that you observed from Judge Mcburney himself that would give you cause to believe that is a grounds for appeal?
Yeah, that is very curious, Jesse. That's a huge number when we're talking about the questions that the jury, kind of sent in and were asking these individuals, to add more specificity or whatever the case might be. I was kind of shocked by that in and of itself, and it does lend itself to this idea that though they might not be physically sequestered when this is going on, that there is a sequestering of the trying of fact here, that it's not out in the open. You know what I'm saying? That in the forum in which the court is conducted. When I had chance to get on stand and would answer questions under direct and cross. That information, just comes out. Everyone in the court can hear it, including the judge and the jury and the defendant and all these things. And it's in an open forum, this idea that they're kind of constructing this thing to this degree. I don't have a problem with the jury asking for more specificity and clarity. I think that that's very important. But wow, that number is a real head scratcher. You're telling me,
Joseph. Anyway, we will always update everyone about the Tex McIver case and what is happening. We covered it gavel to gavel. So again, here on Law and Crime, we will follow that case. But we want to switch gears right now because we are waiting for our live feed in a different case, a case out of Massachusetts, a case of a Boston pastor, a reverend named Shaun Harrison, who is on trial for multiple crimes, including the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. It's alleged that Mr. Harrison, this reverend, this community activist, was actually leading a double life as a drug kingpin. He enlisted the help of this high school student named Mr. Rodriguez because Harrison was one of the deans at that high school. They had a dispute over decreased drug sales, and Harrison lured him out one night and shot him in the back of the head, execution style. Miraculously, the victim, Mr. Rodriguez, survived and testified in open court that Harrison was the shooter. This unbelievable case is unfolding before our eyes, and we are waiting for a live feed. What I want to do right now, though, is play the testimony of a key witness, Kevin Perez, another student in the high school who said, I saw Mr. Harrison smoking, at least had marijuana. I saw him providing marijuana to people. He asked me if I wanted to sell marijuana. And not only that, he asked me if I would attack or take out Luis Rodriguez, the victim. So this is a key witness for the state. Let's listen a little more to his testimony. This is Kevin Perez. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. That was Kevin Perez, a key witness testifying against the defendant in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case, a Boston pastor who's on trial for a lot of different crimes, including attempted murder. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we might be live in that very case. Stay tuned. That literally, I can't even tell you that story about the lawmaker who was found drunk wandering around. The irony of that is just amazing. You can learn more about those stories on lawandcrime.com. So, everybody, we are focusing on the Shaun Harrison case, a Boston pastor who's on trial for drug charges, gun charges, as well as the attempted charges in connection with the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. So he's in a lot of hot water. Before we go back live into the courtroom, I want to bring back on my very special guest, Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. For all of our viewers and all of our listeners, on the stand right now is Sarah Horst, a crime lab technician, talking about the analysis of different drugs, and we'll dip in there in a second. But Joseph, from your perspective, what is the biggest hole in this case? So we talk so much about the prosecution saying, hey, investigators found drugs, ammunition, guns in his apartment. Multiple witnesses are coming forward and saying he was a drug dealer, he was a violent guy, he was not the reverend that people think him to be, all these kinds of things. So what do you think is the biggest advantage for the defense?
Well, I think that there was a whole slew of evidence that's not going to be able to be seen in court as a result of the illegal stop and frisk, and I think that could lend itself to some damage in this particular case.
Let's back up and just explain what that is. So there were 3 people that were allegedly leaving Harrison's apartment. It's believed that they were 3 drug dealers. They were arrested by officers, and and we'll talk about why it was an illegal stop and frisk. Apparently they didn't have enough grounds to arrest them, even though they had suspicion. And what did they find on them? Guns, drugs, cell phones that had conversations with Harrison, a police scanner. But that illegal stop and frisk, those 3 individuals were not charged, they were never charged in connection with that arrest. However, it leads to some interesting evidence here in connection with Harrison.
Yeah, and just to back up a bit relative to that evidence, you mentioned the guns. I think one of the things that's so frightening about this case, Jesse, is the level of violence that's involved in it, and I have to think that this might not be the first time down the tracks for these people. And if you have these weapons that are associated with these individuals, are there tiebacks to other unsolved crimes that are out there? And that can be tied back forensically with the weapons that they may have had on their person at that particular time.
You're talking about getting evidence that someone may have never had before. Oh, we found a gun, test it. Oh, it was used in connection with that crime 5 years ago.
Exactly, and you'll see this thread running through many cases like this, where you have a confederacy of these individuals that get involved in all manner of things like this, and it's kind of scary.
That is definitely true. That is definitely true. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to wait to jump into that courtroom. We're working on some audio issues as well as they're just going through some background information right now. Joseph, I want you to stand by. One of the key witnesses that we keep talking about throughout the program is Kevin Perez, another student in this high school. And what did he just talk about before the break? Well, he was there when the victim, Luis Rodriguez, was walking down the corridor in school when, bam, he gets hit, like tackled right through a bathroom door by a student who's been named Loudy, a student named Loudy. And the question became, did Mr. Harrison, this drug kingpin who brought on the help of different high school students, did he enlist the help of that boy named Loudy to tackle Rodriguez? That becomes the question. Was this a hit? Let's learn a little bit more about it from Kevin Perez, a key witness in this case. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. This is Jesse Weber, and that was a really, really interesting back and forth between Kevin Perez, a key witness in this case of Shaun Harrison, and the defense team. Remember, Shaun Harrison is a Boston pastor who's on trial for drug charges, gun charges, as well as the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. Kevin Perez was talking about the fact that the defendant himself asked him if he wanted to sell drugs for him or if he wanted to attack Luis Rodriguez. So I want to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, a really great asset we have here on the program. Now, Joseph, for our listeners who can't see the demeanor of this witness, a high school student talking about being, doing drugs, alleging that Mr. Harrison is a drug dealer, alleging that Mr. Harrison liked guns, violence, asked him to take out Luis Rodriguez, the victim. How did you think this guy did on the stand?
Well, as a young kid, I think that he did okay in the face of being examined by this attorney. He sounds like he's relatively prepared. A bit of circular tete-a-tete there with the attorney, trying to trip him up, I thought, a bit. And the kid didn't really seem like he was going to have any of it. He just kept pushing forward with the facts as he saw them at that moment in time. I don't know. The kid comes across as very lucid. I don't see anything a problem with this kid as a witness. He's a valuable witness though, because this establishes this relationship that the defendant is involved in with not just him but the rest of this crew of kids in the school. And that in and of itself is troubling. You had mentioned earlier, utilizing these kids to kind of strong arm this other kid, and this guy is actually saying that it's escalating. We're going from simply where we want to rough him up to take him out. So, is the defendant giving them specific orders to commit a homicide?
I mean, these are some pretty big accusations leveled against the defendant.
I mean, this is the stuff that you see in an organized crime trial, and without as much embroidery as, in the colorful characters and that sort of thing. It kind of, because these kids are so young, it kind of goes right to the heart of things. You don't have the kind of patina of age that you would.
Right. You have a reverend who's on trial, and it's alleged that he's hiring high school students to be his enforcers. Right. I mean, I can't make this stuff up. It's pretty incredible to watch. We're gonna take a break right now. When we come back, we have a lot more to analyze, and hopefully Joseph and I can break down the actual shooting crime scene, because it's alleged that Mr. Harrison shot Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez survived that shooting attempt, but we're going to break down that shooting and how it may have happened. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. That was Kevin Perez getting a little frustrated on the stand there in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case, a reverend who is on trial for different charges, including the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. It's alleged he lured Rodriguez out one night, shot him in the back of the head, execution style. And this is all because Harrison is alleged to have been leading a double life as a drug dealer, a drug kingpin, enlisting the help of high school students such as Kevin Perez. Kevin Perez says that Harrison tried to asked him if he wanted to sell drugs for him and beat up Rodriguez. Pretty unbelievable stuff. I want to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan. I want to talk about the crime scene real quick before we go back into court. So if this is true, that Harrison lured Rodriguez out one night into a public area, they were walking by outside. We have the footage of what appears to be the shooting, them walking out in the snow, shoots him back in the head. Why on earth would a suspect like this, would a defendant, would anybody go into a public place outside and try to kill somebody? Call me crazy, but if you're trying to kill somebody, wouldn't you try to do it in a remote, closed location?
Yeah, this seems like a theme that we keep revisiting in all of these cases. Yeah, I mean, where logic applies, and I don't know how much logic goes into a lot of this, a lot of deep thought. Talking about the video, I finally had an opportunity to take a look at this thing, and I got to tell you, if prosecution was using this as their single piece of evidence, that's a ship with a lot of holes in it.
Because it's so grainy, you don't know who's who.
God. Yeah, it's horrible. You can't really make that much out. This isn't a Hollywood. These cameras aren't set up to capture every fine detail. Certain things can be applied. But you would think that you would do this. I tell you, this drives to me one point. Talking about doing this in public, if you're so emboldened that you would do this in public, this attempted execution, it would seem that one of the drivers behind this might be an impassioned event where something has occurred to, as we say in the South, get his blood up to the point where he's making him, he's so infuriated and angry that he's just going to go out on a public street like this and shoot this young man in the back of the head. I got to know what else is going on here.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Is this guy so defiant? Toward this man that he got his hackles up this much. I think that goes to the nature of the case and kind of the type of person you're dealing with here.
Yeah, some people have suspected this might have been an impulse. They got into an argument right on the spot and he, bam, just took it out. I mean, if you believe that Harrison is the shooter. We are going to go live right now into that courtroom. Eric Savick is on the stand. He's a fingerprint examiner, and guess what he has in his hands? The gun. Let's go right now.